Hello there and welcome to the Mythic Iron Docks. My name is Tuskeh and in this video we are going to go over the Iron Docks on its Mythic difficulty, discussing what's changed, what hasn't, and offering suggestions for improvement during the public testing process. Before we begin, it's important to note that the content you are about to see is work in progress, and anything can change before this hits live servers. Indeed, I believe Mythic Dungeons are going to see quite an overhaul sometime soon, but I still feel like these videos may offer some feedback. Now, let's get started. So this first trash pack isn't really difficult in the slightest. I never really felt like we were in any kind of danger, although I will say the Battle Master did hit fairly hard. That Blade Storm he does is actually pretty dangerous. I'd like to see more stuff done with that. Maybe increase its damage a little bit so he has to be kited in some kind of way, or maybe just like make the tank move in away from the rest of the group. It would be a little bit unfriendly to melee, but overall I think that a lot of the damage that comes into the group is kind of piled onto the Battle Master rather than any of the other mobs with all of their different abilities. I mean, you see the Incinerator does this incendiary slug that can be dispelled, but it doesn't really do much damage. It's like 1,500 damage. But I mean, the Battle Master just does so much damage that I think that either tuning him down and increasing everything else, or just flat out increasing everything else, might be a good idea. Now, the second trash pack is more of the same, except there's not a Battle Master here, so it's actually really not too difficult. The Foot Soldiers don't really seem to do anything except for this kind of leap that doesn't do too much damage, and the Deadeye and the Incinerator are just kind of doing a bit of group damage. It's not too difficult, except when they all kind of target the same player, and then they take a little bit more damage, but it's not really all that difficult to heal. Moving on, we encounter Champion Druna, who actually fires these barbed arrow barrages, and they actually do a lot of damage to the group. I'm happy with how much damage this does. It actually really quite hurts. It was taking off a good quarter of the group's health when they came in, although I'm a little bit disappointed that the fire that spawns with it doesn't stick around for longer, because it would have made the fight a little bit more interesting. But as it stands, the fire just comes down, you step away from it, and you try and stay spread out. If you weren't spread out, this would probably hurt a lot. So I suppose that kind of makes up for the fact that the fire doesn't really stick around. Moving on here, you'll see the tank actually aggro Siege Master, Olugar, and a pack at the same time. So we're dealing with Olugar, a Battle Master, a Technician, and a Foot Soldier, and an Incinerator. So this actually deals a fair amount of damage. The Enhancement Shaman gets hit quite a few times here because the Siege Master has this overhead smash that deals damage around the tank. He also puts down this weapon that deals a lot of damage. I'm quite happy about how much damage that weapon deals. You stay in there too long, you'll die really quickly, so that's good. The Battle Masters also do this kind of chain pull, and it's really annoying in all honesty, but I think that it's a good mechanic, and it really makes you worry about what these Battle Masters do. Again, I think maybe a little bit too much in terms of mechanics piled onto the Battle Masters. Maybe give some of the other NPCs a bit more to do. Maybe give that chain held to the Foot Soldier, might be kind of cool. But anyway, this trash pack isn't too nasty, especially if you put a little bit of CC in there. After that, we have this next pull with Pit Warden Guanok. Now, he actually buffs everyone around him, which actually makes the tank take a lot of damage here, but it didn't feel unhealable. I think that if we were in worse gear, the tank would have really struggled with this. But as it stands, this is all fine. The tank takes a hefty amount of damage, but I'm able to keep him alive, even through a couple of chain pulls that pull me in and make me panic for a moment, but nothing too really to worry about, especially once the DPS starts killing things. Now, I think with a bit of CC, this pack would be nice and easy, and I think it's just fine. Now, for the first boss, Fleshrender Nokgar. Now, he has all of the mechanics that he has on Heroic, but he doesn't have anything added at this point, so I'd like to make a couple of suggestions. So you have Dreadfang and him, and I'd like to see some kind of mechanic that involves the archers. Now, I think that Nokgar and Dreadfang are kind of uninteresting. They haven't really got much in terms of mechanics. You see here where the Enhancement Shaman actually gets killed because some kind of aggro drop mechanic happens, or maybe it was just a bug, or I'm not entirely sure. The Death Knight might have been a tiny bit slow there. But in any case, maybe doing some kind of aggro drop mechanic as soon as the boss drops down might be kind of cool. Maybe also do it with Dreadfang to give the tank something to think about. But in terms of new mechanics, I like the idea of, first of all, these archers actually hit very hard. You'll notice actually when I get hit by a barbed arrow barrage, which is unavoidable, I take about 100k, which is just about a third of my health, which is actually quite a lot of damage. So if you were all stacked up together, that would really rip you apart. But that's not really too much of a big deal if you're all spread out. Now, in terms of new mechanics, I'd like to see the archers actually become attackable, and although they're really far away, what you could do is you add some kind of mechanic where they continue to spawn. There's more and more of them coming along, and the raid damage increases, like how often these arrow barrages come down would increase. And I still think the fire doesn't last long enough, but that's just me. And maybe the way you can deal with these extra archers is some kind of new mechanic, like maybe some kind of iron ballistae that fires a massive arrow at someone, and if you avoid it, it spawns like the arrow on the ground and you can throw it back in some kind of way. Maybe use your own ballistae to shoot up at the archers and kill a bunch of them and reduce the raid damage. Or maybe you could target it at the boss and deal damage to him instead, so you can have kind of a choice aspect as to which one you kill. So I think that's kind of cool. But other than that, the flesh render didn't really feel too challenging, and it was a tiny bit disappointing. Now moving on to the next trash pack, these Ogron hit fairly hard, and they have a little bit of raid damage. It's not too high. I keep saying raid damage when I mean group damage. It's the same thing though. They basically just deal damage to everyone. It's not too bad, and they have this flurry attack that hits the tank fairly hard. If you pulled more than one, it might be dangerous, but as it stands, there's nowhere in the dungeon where you have to pull more than one at a time. You only have to fight 3 at maximum, really. So these trash packs aren't too nasty, and they have no new mechanics. Moving on to the iron stars that allow you to progress through this kind of dock down here. I think what might be cool here is not including the iron stars, or maybe only having one of them, so that on the mythic difficulty you have to really aim it and you can't kill everything. Maybe making it so that it's the one in the middle, so you can't just go right down the right-hand side and kill everything. So you'd have to worry about patrols, or maybe even pulling a couple of them and making your own kind of groups to fight. It might be a little bit RNG, which is the only thing I'd be worried about, but really this bit is so easy that it's more of just a cool little mechanic that you can do. And on mythic difficulty, it might be cool to actually have that be a bit more of a challenge by having to aim the iron star in a kind of a different way, make sure you get a particularly nasty mob out of the way by running him over, and then you pull the rest one by one, or maybe not one by one, maybe like one pack at a time, and they're less difficult because you aimed your iron stars correctly. Now moving on to this next pack, this one actually hits fairly hard because this Iron Chainmaster here, this Gromcar Chainmaster, actually buffs everything around it, and that includes an Ogron, which means that it deals a lot of damage. You notice there I try and run out into the cannon barrage to see how much damage it deals. Later on I do get hit by it, and it only deals about 30k damage a second. And we have a few adds here, but still the tank, while taking a fair amount of damage, doesn't really feel like they're in too much danger, except for this moment here, I suppose, where they're taking a lot of damage. So I suppose in less amounts of gear, this might actually be fairly nasty. So a bit of CC here would definitely help. And it seems like Mythic would be designed around CC. I very nearly lose this person here to the random damage going out. There's a lot of damage coming out with these axe hells, and I'm very happy about that. And you'll notice we actually just dropped someone there because that person, unfortunately, had either DC'd or wasn't with us. We've been formatting this for quite a while, and we haven't wiped, so it's not really too much of a big deal. And with a strong healer and tank, it seems like this would be fairly easy. So now we have this cannon barrage here, which I'm fairly disappointed it doesn't hit too hard. I don't test it out right now. I test it out a bit later, but it does not deal much damage at all. And it's a little bit disappointing, I have to say. I would like the cannon barrage to take off like half your health per tick. Like, it should be a real punishment of, oh god, you're in loads of trouble. But one cool mechanic I've had an idea of is why not make this cannon barrage hurt the NPCs, the mobs that you fight, and then maybe add like an extra Ogron that you'd have to pull out into the cannon fire, pop all their cooldowns to survive, and the cannon fire can either weaken or kill the Ogron for you. So that might be kind of cool. But other than that, you've got the Chainmaster who throws her chains around and buffs everything around her. This pack isn't as nasty as the last one, especially because we didn't pull anything extra, and it doesn't have an Ogron in it, so this is all fine. Didn't really feel too threatened here, and that little pull on the ground, you just step out of it and you don't get stunned. Then you have another Ogron, which, as we've said before, is fairly easy. I think you could probably even get away with chain pulling this Ogron into the next group if you really wanted to do this and you had a decent amount of gear. I mean, the tank takes a good amount of damage, but it's nothing that feels really, really dangerous, so that's not so bad. Then moving on, we have a group with a Battle Master in it, which means that there's going to be a fair amount of damage going out. You see that they can be stunned, which is a pretty good way to interrupt their Blade Storm, and we have a few things that put fire on the ground and just kind of deal a bit of raid damage. So the damage here is actually pretty high because we have a small area to work with, and I have to use my Spirit Link here. Well, I don't have to, it just helps a little bit because we don't really have too much room because of the cannon barrages, which is good. It's a good use of the room, having that Battle Master in there with his Blade Storm, so that's pretty cool. But this group feels particularly well balanced. As long as you're just doing it smartly, it's not too much of a big deal. Now, moving on to the Grim Rail Enforcers. Now, these guys, they hit fairly hard, as you can see. Makog's kind of AoE circle effect, that kind of blazing strike that he does, hit the enhancement shaman for about half of her health, which is fair because there's no real way to avoid that unless you just move out of melee range. But this fight isn't too difficult. One of our group members got continually hit by the iron traps, in addition to, I think, the explosion from the little robot that the goblin summons. And even then, I could heal her through it, so it wasn't too much of a big deal. You'll see here she gets hit, and I'm just healing her through it. She might have died had I not reacted very fast, but it didn't really feel like too much of a big deal. So changes for this fight. Now, this is a very long fight, I have to say, especially because we actually popped Ariok's bubble a couple of times here. It seems like the shield that she puts on herself isn't very high, which is good. You should have to actually switch when she puts that on herself. And the rest of the mechanics are just kind of the same. Didn't really notice anything different. I'd like Bomb Squad, the little robot that the goblin summons, to actually deal much more damage, maybe even one-shot people, so you could either kill it or move out of its range. Because right now it's just kind of... it's not really difficult to handle. You'll see here I get hit by a fire wave and I very nearly die, so that's good. It's good to know that those fire waves deal a lot of damage. But now, new mechanics. I think that this fight has a lot of mechanics as it is, and just making them a little bit more dangerous would be good. And you see the group's taking a fair amount of damage here, and the tank very nearly dies here, but she's a Death Knight, so she has her Purgatory, and I use a cooldown here to get the group going again, so it's not too much of a big deal. When it comes to adding new stuff, rather than adding like a new mechanic that you have to worry about in terms of like, oh, here's more fire waves, or here's more traps, or anything like that, it might be kind of cool to give them a buff. And my idea was a constant buff that increases their damage depending on the health difference between the highest health and the lowest health one. So if you just did the normal tactic of nuking Ariok, then Makog and Nisa would get like a 100% damage bonus and they'd be doing loads and loads of damage, and it could be really dangerous. But if you kept them all around the same health, they'd only have like a 1 or 2% damage increase. And that way it would make you have to do the fight differently, meaning that you would have to think about who you want to put the shield on, and it would actually incentivize you to switch on the shield a little bit more as well. So it would mean that you'd have to deal with all of the mechanics throughout the entire fight, as opposed to just getting one of them out of the way and then fighting two of them and then one of them, and the fight gets easier. So the fight could just be the same kind of difficulty all the way through, rather than being hardest at the start and then slowly getting easier until it becomes kind of pointless at the end. So moving on, this next trash pack actually was really, really nasty. Now, it might have had something to do with the fact that our tank pulled 2 packs here, but these Thunderlord Wranglers actually do this spear throw that leaves a dot on a player, and it deals a tremendously high amount of damage, especially when you have more than one stack on you. And you start taking a lot of ticking damage very fast, and with the Cleft Hoof charging everywhere, and people getting hit by all kinds of different stuff, and then with the caltrops on the ground that a couple of people stood in, it got very hectic, and I had to use a couple of cooldowns here, I think. Although they may have been on cooldown for the actual boss that I was just on. But it was very nasty, and I had to really concentrate and spend my mana very quickly. And I like that. I think that this is actually really well balanced. And you see we actually lose the Enhancement Shaman there because she got hit by a couple of spears and stood in the caltrops, which means that she was just dead. Very little I could do about that. She just died really fast there. She manages to self-res here, but it isn't really too much of a big deal. We would have got it anyway, and everything was fine once the Cleft Hoof went down and we could kind of stand a bit more still and I could just do some healing. So I like how difficult these guys are and how hard they hit. I think that's very Mythic. And I wouldn't actually add any new mechanics here. I think that things are pretty intense as they are. Now, this next trash pack has this Flame Spitter here, and the fire doesn't seem to hit too hard. It hits fairly hard, but you can move out of it pretty quickly. And I like that you actually have to deal with this mechanic, because on Heroic mode, normally you can just kill the Flame Spitter before the fire becomes a problem, and it's all just hunky-dory at that point. But I would like the Flame Spitter to actually leave its fire on the ground for longer. It only seems to last about 10 or 15 seconds. I think doubling that would make it interesting, so that the second time it put down its fire, it would put it in different locations, and then you'd have a small amount of room to work with, so it would make it very intense, and I think that's much more kind of Mythic, wouldn't you? That's what I'd do anyway. Now, this next trash pack has a Wrangler, a Cleft Hoof, and a Flame Spitter in it, which means that it actually was particularly difficult. What you could do maybe is CC the Wrangler, and maybe if you could get away with it, one of the beasts, because actually the combination of the spear throws from the Wrangler, the fire on the ground, the caltrops, and the Cleft Hoof charging about made this fight kind of nasty, and I ended up having to use my Ascendants here to try and keep everyone alive. Just spreading my Riptides with the new changes to Chain Heal means that I don't have to target people with Riptide to get the full healing of Chain Heal, which is great, makes High Tide much better, but it just adds a lot of freedom to the class, which I like. But anyway, so this trash pack hits fairly hard, but again, I'd like to see the Flame Spitter leave his fire on the ground for longer, necessitating more movement, and it would especially make the Wrangler quite difficult to deal with because he's jumping around with his disengages, throwing spears all the time, and I just think that would be really cool. Maybe either adding one more Wrangler or increasing the duration of the fire from the Flame Spitters might be quite cool. Okay, just before the next boss, O'Shea, we have Siege Master Rokra, a Battle Master, and an Engineer, or a Technician, I should say. Now, this trash pack actually hits really hard. You've got the weapon coming out from the Battle Master, you've got Siege Master Rokra's, I believe he has the overhead smash, that shattering strike that deals a lot of damage to the melee and the tank. So this was actually pretty nasty. I had to heal quite hard here, but it wasn't too much of a big deal. I didn't feel like we were in too much danger as long as I was on the ball, and as you see, that weapon hits particularly hard. Maybe making it hit a bit harder would be cool, but generally I think this fight is just fine. Now, moving on to O'Shea. Now, I didn't really feel like this fight was particularly difficult. There was only a couple of parts in it where I felt like we were in any kind of danger. You see this kind of a swiping mechanic he does here. He doesn't move any faster. It's really easy to avoid. And as long as you know it's coming, it's not really a big deal. So that's perfectly fine. Now, these ravenous wolves that he releases actually hit really quite hard, and you'll see we very nearly lose the enhancement shaman here because of these wolves. So CCing them and then spreading them apart, or just AoEing them down, works pretty well, but they hit very hard, and it actually gave me an idea for a new kind of mechanic for this fight. So I think it would be cool if he had some kind of like 20% or 30% enrage, or maybe a second kind of phase, where he actually just goes kind of crazy and just breaks all of the cages open, and you could have all of the wolves kind of running around, becoming danger zones, like that kind of stuff, and just kind of dealing loads of damage to people. And it could be either do you want to try and control all these creatures and knock them back and stuff, or do you just want to nuke O'Shea and then once he dies all the animals despawn? The time to feed hits fairly hard, although we didn't really have to keep it there for too long because we were doing so much damage to him. Maybe increasing the threshold of the amount of health you have to deal to him to break it might be kind of cool. And of course, any kind of immunities like Hand of Protection also breaks it, so that's fine. And finally, this Rylak Sky Terror didn't really feel very dangerous. It just kind of just left these poison pools on the ground, and they didn't feel too dangerous. Maybe making him do it more often would be cool, although he does do it fairly regularly. Although we did get some stuns off here, so he did it less regularly, so that's kind of cool. I like that you can interrupt it that way. And we didn't actually have to kill him because we just killed O'Shea instead. But I think it would be cooler if he released the animals more frequently and maybe had some kind of second phase where he just releases them all, and it's either do you handle the animals or do you target him and just go for him. Okay, now we move to the last boss of the instance, Skullock. What happens here is everything is the same as in Heroic, but I did notice that Koromar throws these weapons out much more regularly, necessitating the need to spread out. He also does this Berserker Leap that hits fairly hard, and the tank's taking a lot of damage from Skullock and Koromar, and the group takes a fair amount of damage from Zogosh's machine turret. Now, the first time we did this, Koromar didn't actually die before the first knockback. The second time he did, but it was very close. I'd like to see Koromar have a little bit more health to kind of force you to deal with this Blade Storm during the first knockback, and maybe even a second. Now, you'll notice here in this first pull, the tank rushes forward with her anti-magic shield, and very nearly dies. It was very dangerous. She was pretty confident that she could survive it, and she used all of her cooldowns, and she only just survived it. Her Purgatory saved her life. And the second time she tries to pull it off, she dies. And so I'm glad that the amount of damage that the Cannon Barrage does is really, 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 really high, necessitating patience more than just speeding through with an immunity. I'd like it to actually go through immunities, personally. I think that would be really cool. So now with the second pull, we do a bit better. Koromar dies before the first Cannon Barrage phase, and I think it would be cool, as I said, to make Zogosh do something once Koromar dies. I mean, all he does is he jumps out of his machine turret and just melee hits you, and it's not really that dangerous. So what would be cool is if he enraged, right? And it kind of, maybe it decreases movement speed, but the whole idea is that if he hits someone, he almost immediately kills them. Like, he'd take off 2/3 of their health, even like the tank. So what you could do is you'd have to kite him, and you'd have to stun and root him and stuff like that. Maybe make him immune to things like hexes and polymorphs and stuff like that, but like just make it so that you can root and stun him and all that kind of stuff and knock him back. So you'd have to kite him while also facing the boss. Kind of like Terran Gore with the Abyssal that he summons. And I think that would be really cool because you could choose between, do we want to try and kite Zogosh, or do we just want to heal through the damage that Koromar does? So you could have a little bit more choice when it comes to how you handle the fight. But of course, once Koromar and Zogosh die, the fight becomes much easier. You just have to deal with Skullock's Cannon Barrage. Maybe give him some kind of frontal cone ability, might be kind of cool, but that's not really necessary. He deals a lot of tank damage as it is, and the fight is really quite easy once the other guys die. So adding Zogosh in might be quite cool. Maybe have him fixate a random player, or something like that, or maybe do the thing where the last person that hits him is the guy he focuses on, so that might be kind of cool. But really, that's all the ideas I have for Skullock and the Iron Docks in general. I really enjoyed this place. I think it was quite cool. There are some parts of it that I feel could use some new mechanics, and all the bosses need new mechanics in my opinion. Otherwise, it's just going to be Heroic, but a little bit more hard. And that's not really what I think people were expecting. I think that people really wanted to see a whole bunch of new mechanics and see the dungeons kind of in a new light, so that they would have a reason to go back rather than just, oh, it's a little bit more difficult. Because if you outgear the place, there's no reason to go here, which is a real shame because these instances are fun. I enjoyed myself while I did these instances, these mythic dungeons, and having them do new mechanics so you can go there and see, oh, this is the new stuff that happens, would be really, really cool. So, that will conclude this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, I wish you the best of luck in the world of Warcraft.